Welcome everybody. In this lesson, we're going to take our next step into the MVC framework and look at routing. In the first lesson, we looked at controllers and we saw how we could set up controllers and action methods within those controllers to respond to requests based on default routing, based on the conventions that /controller name /action name would send a request to a particular controller. So in this lesson, we're going to look at how to use the power of MVC to customize routing to allow our applications to be more dynamic, more flexible, and to have more complex behaviors. So in particular, we're going to look at default routing. We're going to revisit that topic. We very briefly just introduced you to what default routing was in the last lesson. We're going to look at how we can customize routes. In other words, how we can override the default routing behaviors using the route attribute directly on an action method. We're going to look at how we can use the HTTP GET and HTTP POST attributes on action methods in order to sort of specify that methods should handle one type of request or the other. And we're also going to look at how we can pass parameters into our action methods. And so this isn't necessarily explicitly part of the previous routing discussion, but it's going to be related in a lot of ways, as we'll see. And we'll see that there are kind of three main types that we'll introduce to pass parameters into our action methods. The first is using GET or query parameters as part of the URL path. The second will be using POST parameters, so POST parameters that are submitted with an HTTP POST request. And finally, we'll look at how to use URL segments to pass parameters into an action method. So let's revisit this diagram briefly, since we're covering the different components of an MVC application in turn. And last time we focused on the controllers in the middle of this diagram and looking at how we can use controllers to respond to user requests. And we use default routing, and so the routing engine, recall, is part of the MVC framework, and between the web application server and the framework, they're going to handle the work of receiving a request and then unpacking that HTTP request into different components such as the URL, the path, the request parameters, and any sort of body of the request. So along with headers and all that stuff. So that happens before the code reaches our controller. And in particular, you see that there's this route portion of the server right here. That routes is what's often referred to as the routing engine. Or sometimes there might be a routing table within the application server. So based on the rules that the routing engine or the routing table have in place, that will determine, based on an incoming request, where that request goes to. And we'll see exactly how we do that within MVC as we go through this lesson. So default routing, recall we did this last time. We relied on the default routing, at least, when we were setting up our initial controllers. Default routing has the structure /controller /action. So if we request a path from our application to /home, that will go to the home controller. And then /action will determine which action method within that controller. And so the default values for these are home and index. So if we were to browse to just /, that would go to the home controller, and the index action method, if we were to go to /home, that would go to, again, the home controller and the index action method. But we can also specify action methods within that home controller that aren't indexed. And also we can specify other controllers as well, okay? And we did this last time by looking at the hello controller. So let's go ahead and pop over to Visual Studio, and this is going to pick up right where we left off last time with our hello MVC application. And so I have the same actions and the same responses here within the hello controller, and we're going to look at how we can customize these the routes within this controller to respond in different ways. And I wanted to look at, before we get too deeply into this topic, just the most basic way that we can alter the default routing behavior of MVC. So let's go into, say, right above the goodbye method that we had here, that this just returns the single string goodbye and just displays it as plain text. And we know that this will live at the route hello/goodbye, right? That's the default routing behavior. And so I want to alter it to alter the route to this controller to be /hello/aloha. Okay, so that's what we want to do. Let's just take that one task and see how we can do this. The most basic way to alter a route in MVC is to use the route attribute. So to make an attribute right above the method, let's put a pair of square brackets, and then we'll use route and parens. And within the parens, we put a string that has the new route that we want this controller to live at. All right, let me go ahead and save that, and then let's fire up the application. Okay, so let's browse to hello/aloha. And we see that that indeed returned the goodbye string. All right, so that altered the route so that when we go to this URL, we actually hit the goodbye controller. Let's just see what happens when we actually try to reach the goodbye controller via the previous method. All right, so what happens there is that this route is no longer bound to that method. And so if we were to open up the inspector here in your developer tools, and we could just see what comes back from the server, we see that we got a 404. Okay, so that means that the server actually couldn't find a resource at /hello/goodbye because we changed the route to for that controller to correspond to a different path. Okay, so that was kind of a silly example. We didn't have a good reason for doing that. We just did it more or less to illustrate that we could. Let's go into some more explicit examples, and we'll see how we can customize routes for actually some specific purpose. Okay, so currently our Hello World application still does the minimal Hello World sort of functionality. It just displays a string, Hello World. I want to change the application so that it's able to display customized hello messages in various sort of ways. So the first way I want to do this is to have it respond to a query string. And so that if I were to say hello, (name equals Chris, that would respond with hello, Chris. Okay, so this isn't necessarily, specifically customizing the route in the sense of customizing the path, but it's related to how this request is handled and how we customize what happens on the back end. So let's go ahead and look at our code here. And so what I want to do within my index method, so this is going to still correspond to the index method, and it's just going to alter the fact that this method can now accept a parameter as a query string. Okay, so I'm going to go and I'm going to put a parameter here, string name. All right, and so this, just by defining this parameter as an input parameter to the index method, this will enable this method to accept query parameters that have the same actual name. So these names have to be linked. They can't be different. Okay, so and then we can just go and use this parameter within our method. So instead of saying hello world, I'm going to create a formatting string. So I'm going to use string.format. And I'm going to insert name for the placeholder there. Okay, and now this will respond correctly if I put (name equals something). If I leave off the name, this would just present us with just an empty hello message. It would just say hello without anything after that. So one good thing we want to think about here when we're looking at how our controllers accept data from the user is whether or not there should be some sort of default behavior, whether or not we should be checking for things being empty or not. So in this case, let's just say that we want the default behavior. If the user doesn't give us a name in the query string, we want the default behavior to respond as hello world as we previously did. Okay, so this is going to amount to basically checking to see if name has a value. So I'm going to use a conditional. And that check, I'll fill that in a second, but basically if name doesn't have a value, I want to set name equal to world. Okay, so what should this check be? If we don't provide a value in that query string, will it be empty or will it be null? Well, that's a good question. So in general, both of those are logical guesses. In this particular case, it happens that name will be null. Let's go ahead and just use, though, the slightly conservative approach of using the method string.isNull or empty, which will check for both at the same time. And if it's null or empty, we'll insert the value world and we'll respond with that. So let's go ahead and start this up. Okay, so we're going to browse to /hello, and then we're going to give a query parameter, name equals your name. All right, there we go. That seemed to work. Let's look at what happens if we take off name. And we get the default hello world. And let's just see actually what happens, whether this was empty or null. If you didn't know, if you didn't remember, you could just set a breakpoint. We haven't looked at using the debugger within MVC applications, but it's the same as any other application within Visual Studio. So you can set a breakpoint there. And let's go back and request the same URL. And we'll stop at the breakpoint. And then let's inspect that name is actually null. So name is null if it's not provided by the user. However, there's also something the user could do here, which is they could say, well, before I do that, let me go back and continue through the breakpoint. All right, so the user could say name equals and then not specify anything. And in that case, the name would still be null. All right, so there you go. So it's always a good thing to check. One more way that you can handle this scenario is to provide a default value in the method signature. So you can do this as well, and then you can get rid of that. Okay. And I'm not going to restart because that'll take a few seconds, but this actually provides the same sort of functionality as doing a conditional check within our method for whether or not the name is null or empty. Okay, so that enabled us to respond to a GET request with a query parameter. Let's look at the next level of complexity, which is to respond to a POST request. And let's see what we can do with that. It turns out that we're still going to have the same sort of method signature here of name, string name equals world, but in the POST request scenario, it's a little bit more complicated because we first need to present a form to the user so that they can fill out the form and submit a POST request. So displaying the form and then responding to the request, those two pieces of functionality should really be contained in different controllers. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at how we might build a different controller in a way that allows this to work properly. So let's go ahead and make a new controller. And I'm going to say this is, I'm just going to call this display. And this controller is really going to do pretty much what the index controller does right now. We want it to accept a name parameter. And we want it to return a greeting as HTML. All right. The main difference here is that this is going to respond to POST requests. We'll figure that out in just a second. Let's go back up here and fix our index method first. We said that we want our behavior to be that the user is presented with a form where they can enter their name. They then click submit on the form, and they are presented with the customized hello message. So the index method should display the form. Let's figure out how we can do that. So in the next lesson, we're going to look at getting into or the next class rather, we're going to look at getting into views and how to use Razor templates to create templates and create views in sort of a proper MVC way. But right now we're just going to we're going to focus in on the controller world. So we're not going to create separate views, and we're just going to build up our HTML within the controller. So this isn't something that you'll really do often or really ever should do, but until we get to learning about views, it's something that we're going to say is okay. So I'm going to build up my response string as a variable called HTML. And then down here, instead of returning this message, I can just return that. And this response string is going to contain the form that is presented to the user. So we just want to put in some HTML to display a form. Oops, I'm going to put this on separate lines just so it's a little bit more readable. And each time I need to concatenate. When I go to use quote marks within the HTML, in order to not terminate the strings in C#, I'm going to use single tick marks. Alternatively, you could do something with escaping the double quotes, but single tick marks a little easier to type. All right, so we're going to create a text input, and I'm going to give it the name. This is going to be the name here is going to be the parameter name, the parameter key that's passed into the request, that's passed to the server. All right. And then I'm going to make an input of type submit. All right, I'm going to give it a custom little bit of text just for fun. And then I need to close my form. Great. So normally, obviously, we would wrap everything with the proper HTML tags, the HTML, the head, the body, all of that stuff. For this little example, though, this will still render properly within the form. We'll do all of that proper stuff and use the best practices when we start working with templates. Okay, so that will display a form to the user, and then we need to specify how this form is going to be processed. In other words, we need to tell the browser where it should send the form data when it's processing it. And in particular, there's two pieces here that dictate how that data is sent to the server. The first is the method. In this case, we want our form to post. So I'm going to say method equals post. The other one is action. Okay, so if we want our form to post to the URL /hello/display, we need to put that as the action. If you leave the action off, we'll see what happens with that in a minute. That would just post to the exact same location that the form was displayed at. So let's save, and let's, if you haven't stopped your server, go ahead and stop it, and we'll restart it. Recall that every time you make changes to a C# file within an MVC application, you need to restart the server for those changes to be reflected. And sometimes this will happen. This basically just says that the server wasn't finished shutting down when I tried to start it up. You can just abort that build and start a new build. Okay, so we want to go to /hello. And this should display our form if we did everything correctly. All right, that looks good. Our form had two elements. It had a text box and it had a submit button with the message greet me. Let's go ahead and put in just your name, hit greet me, and we see that our form data was posted to the /hello/display URL, and that indeed that data was inserted into the response properly. Okay, so that's great. That's one way we can handle form submission. I'm going to show you a different way and a slightly more aesthetically pleasing way for some. And this is the way we've handled things in Unit 2 for handling forms, which is that we, in some cases, might prefer that our form data was posted to the same URL that displayed the form. In other words, this particular form is displayed when we go to /hello. It would be nice if we could just leave off this action attribute and have the form data displayed, the form posted to the same URL and the form response displayed at the same URL. Okay, to do that, we need to customize the route. We need to break the default routing behaviors. The default routing behaviors specify that there's only one way to get to this method. Well, there's one and only one way. If I say /hello or /index, those ways will both route to the index method. The same thing for display. If I say /hello /display, that way is the only way to get to the display method. So I want to customize this in a way that will allow post requests from this form and post requests to the URL /hello to end up at this controller. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to use something new, which is a route attribute. So above the method display, go ahead and add a pair of square brackets, and we want to say route with 2 parentheses, and then between the parentheses, we specify the route that we want this controller to be mapped to for incoming requests. Okay, so I say that this should be a /hello. This action method should handle requests to /hello. Now, there's one more piece about this, which is that as it is, these two would basically be having the same responsibility. Okay, so this method would respond to requests to /hello, as with this one. We need to differentiate by request type. Okay, so we need to differentiate between which one should handle the get request and which one should handle the post request. So to do that, I can further add the HTTP post attribute. Okay, and then up here, let me add HTTP get. Okay, so now explicitly we've specified that this method should respond to get requests, this method should respond to post requests. Okay, and in terms of functionality, we want the same behavior. The only difference in this and the last example when we ran our application is that our form now ceases to have an action attribute, and it will post data to the same URL that the form is displayed at. So our display message will exist at the same URL. So let's go ahead and start it up, and let's see if that was successful. Okay, so let's go to /hello. And if everything goes correctly, we will still see the same form presented as it was last time. And indeed it is. Let's type in your name, hit the greet me button, and notice at this time the URL that data was posted to was the same as the URL that the form was displayed at, /hello, but it displayed the correct message, which indicates that that request to /hello was correctly routed to the display method. So even though we broke the default routing rules here, we achieve this behavior by specifying that route /hello is routed to the display method. At least when we're posting. When we're issuing a get request, we still just display the form. Okay, so that's just an easy little way to customize routing behavior within your controller. I want to show you just a couple more different things you can do, 2 or 3 more things you can do with routing customization and parameter handling within this context. All right, so let's look at a third way to handle parameters. So the first 2 ways we've handled, just to recap very quickly, are we've looked at handling parameters submitted via a get request and the query string, and we've looked at handling parameters submitted via a post request where the parameters are in the post body. What I want to do now is look at a situation where the user could respond to requests, or the user can make a request that we would respond to, rather, that would look like this. So we would have the URL /hello, and then we would use what's called a URL segment. This is URL segment. There we go. This piece is what's called the URL segment, and we can use those URL segments as parameters that are passed into our controller methods or our actions. And so at the end of the day, I want to be able to respond to requests that look like this and have the same behavior that we had above. Okay, so let's look at how we can do that. I want to say public. I'm just going to build a controller stub here. All right, so I have the basic outline of my controller. I want this controller to accept as above string name. Okay, and then I want it to basically do the same thing we do here, where that name is inserted as a hello message. The one thing that's very different in this situation is I want it to respond to requests with a certain URL structure, with a certain path structure. To do that, I can still use the route attribute as we did before, and I can say that route /hello, and I can say that the route furthermore has a variable URL segment called name, and I specify that by putting name within brackets there as a part of the URL. Okay, and so the routing engine will then detect this, and an incoming request to this guy will be matched to this particular handler. Now, what if I were to use /hello /goodbye as the name? Well, there's a potential conflict between that, and there's a complex set of rules around how routes are matched to a controller, and there's precedents involved. For the time being, I would say that as you're learning this stuff, probably avoid those types of things. If you think that a valid value for a name would be goodbye, then you probably shouldn't make an action method of the same name. And if you need to know those sort of nuances, you can dive into the MSDN documentation on this stuff. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop our server and restart it, and let's see if we can make a request to /hello /your name and have a proper message be displayed. All right, so I want to be able to go to, well, let me just clear the screen so when it actually does refresh, we'll see that it changes. Okay, there we go. And I want to be able to go to URLs like this is what we're testing. And we see, there we go, that did map indeed to this method right here, okay? So there are a lot more rules around how you can create variable URL segments that are then pass data into your action methods. We'll put some links to those in the resources section for this video, but just know that this is the most basic way you can do it, and this will often be pretty handy. You'll be able to get a lot of miles out of this basic technique of passing data into an action method this way. All right, so there are two more things I want to look at just briefly, sort of two little comments. I want to show you how you can redirect from a request. So I'm going to make a new, well, actually, let's just do it this way. Let's find a method that we can alter. Let's go ahead and alter the hello method. All right. So instead of presenting the form with this basic index method, what I want to do is just set up a redirect, so when someone requests this resource, they're redirected to the goodbye method. Okay, so to do that, instead of returning some content, I'll go ahead and stop my server here. Instead of returning content, I'm going to return a redirect. Okay, so I can use the redirect method to create a redirect result object, and that is then returned to the user. And we just need to specify where the user should be redirected to. So to do that, we specify the path that they should be redirected to. Okay, so let's fire that up and see that that works. So this time, instead of displaying the name when we go to /hello, we'll do the slightly backwards behavior of telling the person goodbye, but that's just to illustrate the basic redirect points. We'll use redirects in more logical and complex ways in coming classes in coming weeks. Okay, so when I go to /hello, hopefully we'll be redirected to /hello /goodbye. There we are. All right, there we go. And that's some basic ways that you can customize routing behavior to handle GET requests, POST requests, and to override the default routing rules of ASP.NET MVC. And those will allow us to kind of build a lot of applications in most use cases. Just a reminder, the routing rules and the ways we can pass parameters into our controllers here and our action methods, they get much more complex than this, but these approaches will serve you best. If you want to do something beyond the scope of this lesson, definitely look it up. Definitely use the resources on MSDN. They're really great. And we'll probably introduce one or two more methods of customization as we go through this unit.